You're listening to The Capital Table. Private capital markets have been evolving for many years, but never more so than in recent times. Take a seat at the Capital Table with leading experts discussing insights into the private equity and M&A worlds, and take away the knowledge you need to excel in a rapidly changing marketplace. We know this is one table you'll leave feeling full and satisfied.
Everybody, welcome to this edition of the Capital Table. Excited today to continue our conversation with Marina Gentili of Witham, who leads our transfer pricing practice. And this is part two of the series we started talking about transfer pricing and M&A. And today we're going to focus on issues around tariffs and how that ties into transfer pricing. So, Marina, thanks for joining us again.
Course, and really happy to be here. Yes, the world has turned a bit upside down in terms of global trade and increased tariffs and increasing uncertainty. And whoever thought this would be part of the diligence process as well, but it really has to be, right? When you're acquiring the global business, you need to understand what you're buying. And now it's just a whole new world. I mean, the transfer pricing's been big over the last sort of 5 to 7 years, where it was ignored before, and now the tariffs are going to be just as big. We need to ask the questions.
Well, that's really interesting how, with tariffs entering into the picture for deal makers and how they're looking at opportunities. Obviously, not just global businesses; it's U.S. based businesses with customers strictly in the U.S. But I think the real interesting part to me, it's not just that they're importing goods or sourcing a big chunk of materials. You kind of got to go backwards in the chain and understand where these materials are coming from and what the impact of tariffs is.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. It just changes the dynamic of the cost of your product, right? And how much can you really pass along to the customer or not, right? It's hard to tell. Everything is very case specific, but never before have companies themselves, not just, the acquiring company that needs to know, but the company themselves need to really make sure they understand fully their supply chain and how that works. And then, obviously a company interested in them as a target acquisition needs to understand it as well. It's crazy. And that's whether you have a related party channel of, through your supply chain, or you could be purchasing just from a third party manufacturer in China. You don't have to be a global business. You could be selling in a U.S. company selling into the U.S. market, but your supply chain is coming from overseas. And so it now dramatically impacts. So.
And you made the comment, how it impacts diligence. So let's kind of look at that for a moment here. And, I think one area, just based on what you and I were just talking about back and forth, is, what are you seeing as the issues? And I guess my kind of part two of that question is, if you're looking at a manufacturer who's sourcing material from, could even be U.S.-based companies, how far up the supply chain do you have to go? That's my real question. And, what are the issues you're seeing in diligence?
Yeah, no, it's pretty far back, right? Because the product, has to do with country of origin and then the type of product that it is. And they have different tariff implications now. So the system has become really complicated. Whereas in the past, you could understand your tariff position a little bit easier, right? Now we have these, retaliatory tariffs, stacking tariffs, there's a whole sort of sequence. And what it's doing is forcing companies now to take what's effectively, one product sale price and try to dissect it. So you're getting more and more granular, which pieces come from China, which pieces have aluminum, just whatever, they have different tariff treatments. So you want to obviously mitigate the tariff impact as much as possible, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly, looking at investments and potential deals, understanding the cost side of it's really obviously paramount and an interesting challenge when things seem to change by the hour, depending on which week it is. But certainly a lot of times it's changing so frequently. But I guess other than that cost side of the equation, because you've been super deep in this issue with our clients and the marketplace. I mean, what are the big concerns they have beyond what's my product going to cost me? And, the issues and conversations you're having with them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to be honest with you, Steve, like I could make the argument now that supply chain considerations and customs and tariff positions should have been part of the diligence to begin with of a global business, but it didn't hit the radar hard enough, right? And now it's there, it's front and center. And so the questions are around, as a buyer, what am I buying exactly? And what potential risk do I have? Okay. Because we should be looking back. There's a 5-year statute of limitations, which could even increase to more years. So we should be sort of looking back saying, have they treated this properly? Have they declared their customs properly? Because what we're seeing now with clients is they're taking one of two approaches. Either they're, I'm going to do nothing until I hear what happens on July 9th, right? And, because things are paused right now, right? Which I don't think that's a good idea because something's going to happen. So let's just be prepared and ready. The other is sort of that knee-jerk reaction of, I'm just going to dump my customs price. I'm going to, sell it below cost or, whatever I have to do. And that's a really bad idea, right? That is, tax manipulation, right? Like there's no way to sugarcoat that. A tariff is a tax, right? And just like with transfer pricing, you cannot make these decisions for tax motivated reasons. So the fact that tariffs went up is not a reason to lower your customs declaration value. You need to really quantify that and have sort of business economic reasons for doing that. And it's honestly not intuitive to a lot of companies. So they could be inadvertently, doing this without understanding the regulations. And then you've got a buyer coming in and, not knowing what questions to ask. But those are the questions, right? Like around that, and where is your supply chain, and is it secure, and is it efficient, right? We talk to companies all the time, like European Asia Pac headquarters will come to North America and establish one distributor, right? It's usually in the US. And then from there, they'll on-sell to Canada or Mexico. Well, now we're in a position saying, why on earth would product enter the US, pay high tariffs, and then exit to another market? So we're restructuring companies. We're reconsidering supply chains. And so just making sure that it's efficient. And I think people in the transaction advisory space need to just assess and ask the right questions about it.
And you're touching on an issue that I think is really interesting because, us being in the U.S. and working with the client base that we work with obviously tend to be private equity strategics who are buying companies in the U.S. and what is going to be the impact on that company. But I know we've seen, not for this reason in particular, but we are seeing more activity for foreign buyers looking at making acquisitions in the U.S. Primarily, my contention would be just to access the U.S. market and maybe ahead of what was the tariff issue, just thinking from a business standpoint, to make product here, be able to sell product here.
Yeah.
What should those buyers do? In other words, I'm flipping the lens around, looking into the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, listen, there's a lot of tax incentives, both state and federal incentives and grants in terms of actual production manufacturing here in the US now. So someone that's looking to establish into the market, service customers in the market, might take a more serious look about actually manufacturing here versus, transferring product in. I mean, there's obviously many advantages to that, right? Your supply chain is immediate, it's right there, and you can get your goods to market faster. But now, certainly with the tariffs, it's a factor, and it should be considered more fully. If that's not an option, then it's just discussing the product flow, and it's very different. Like, I work with companies, for example, that sell perishable goods. They cross the border every single day with their perishable goods, right? So that's a whole different element. That's like an operation that, has a certain rhythm to it. There are some that, shift goods or transfer goods into the US or wherever, monthly or quarterly, right? So it all depends on the profile and the product. But there are so many, you can't avoid the tariffs, but you can mitigate them. There are ways to absolutely mitigate them. And so to me, those are the discussions that we want to have. And then also understand the balance between, think of the US administration, right? They up the tariffs, we get increased tariff revenue. Well, that importer of record is usually a US distributor with very thin margins to begin with. Okay. So that, or any country distributor, in my example, it's the US. So, looking at that model, it's that entity is the entity that bears 100% risk of the tariff. So they must pay the tariff. They can get relief if they, can renegotiate a supply agreement, but that's pretty hard to do. They could pass along some of the cost to the customer, and sometimes that works, but honestly, sometimes it doesn't. I got clients selling to Home Depot and Costco, and they frankly just don't care. They're like, we want our product, in the warehouse, same as always, same price, right? So it's not the same for everyone. So it's hard to talk it through in a broader sense, right? Of course, I have interviews and articles and webinars out there, but until you have that sort of one-on-one conversation about the company, you get sort of granular there.
Yeah, so we've been talking about looking at buying companies, making acquisitions. Let's flip the lens again this time to if you're a company wanting to sell in the next 6 months, year, 2 years, perhaps. Yeah. Other than doing the same sort of things you're talking about, and we've already discussed, I mean, what are some key issues for potential sellers above and beyond, the groundwork that you've already laid?
Yeah. So any company that's a global business needs to really understand that their business is complicated just by the definition of they're a global business. So, and they need to really, to make themselves the most attractive to buyers, spend the time looking to make sure they have everything in place and they have the most efficient global structure. And that means the entity setup and the planning, the supply chain and transfer of goods or services or whatever is happening with this company. They need to really make sure that, they're minimizing taxes as much as possible, right? They understand where their cash flow is. They're trying to reduce their transfer pricing risk. They have some handle on the tariff situation. Like all these things, they need they get more attractive when the buyer of an international business comes in and is savvy and is asking all the questions. They need to be able to answer. Our intangibles are here, and look, our transfer pricing reflects that. Because those are the things that trip up the deal, Steve, right? Those are the things is lack of understanding of who owns the intangibles, which entities, like, okay, is it Brazil or is it the US? Because that buyer wants to know what they're dealing with, right? In terms of any, assets of the business. And also sort of a disconnect between like a transfer pricing report, like a benchmarking study, versus an intercompany legal agreement versus what's actually in the accounting, the substance in the accounting. And believe it or not, Steve, sometimes those three things do not match, when of course they should match completely, right? Because right? And so it just becomes, when things like that are messy, the buyer feels like, well, what else is out there? Like, let's look further. And then they're thinking, let's make sure we're, accounting for this risk, right? Whether it's a lower purchase price or some type of contingency after close, right?
Right. And mentioning that, I guess let's discuss for a moment or two, that whole post-deal environment. You've assessed the risk, closed the transaction, you laid out a plan, but there's other post-deal considerations, and maybe my little 2 cents for our audience. When Liberation Day happened, very soon thereafter, like probably 4 minutes later, you jumped on this issue of tariffs and how it impacts transfer pricing. And to me, it was just fascinating to see how the two are interwoven so closely. So
Yeah.
in the post-deal environment, kind of with that particular thread, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's you have to look at your new global structure because it's new and it's global. And the thing about acquisitions are, like, you are acquiring a business for a reason. That business is standalone and has their own intangibles or secret sauce or value. It's not like you're globally expanding by setting up a subsidiary, right, with no people in it yet, and then building, right? You have control of that process. But when you buy a fully existent company and you buy it for a reason, now you have the possibility of what I call sprinkling intangibles all over the world. And as a global business, that is not an ideal structure. The ideal structure is you have one king of the global business, one entrepreneur, one entity that develops funds, owns the intangible assets. You could have a development team of 500 people in India, but as long as you're paying them with a markup over costs and they're not actually funding the development, they're just implementing, then, you still have that position of one intangible owner. Everyone else is some kind of routine entity. They're selling something, they're manufacturing something, they're, service of some sort. So, unfortunately, there's no easy answer to this because nobody wants to have to value an asset, transfer it, and then it's a taxable event, right? But you definitely want to pull people in to assess the risk around that, okay? Because sometimes, like an entity buys another entity somewhere, they immediately change the name. They immediately change the technology platform they're using, right? And you start seeing these things like, well, okay, then that's not an intangible. That's not an intangible. It just went away. So then what is it? A customer list? We can deal with that. We can compensate with that through transfer pricing without having it be dramatic and a risk of the tax authority saying, no, this entity owns intangibles too. And then you need some kind of profit split.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, great stuff, Marina. And we could talk about this for hours, I think, because it's really so complicated. And again, you've, with the addition of the tariff discussion, recently dived into this issue and really have a great grasp of it. So with that, I know since things are changing by the hour, you're very busy, and appreciate your time talking about this on the Capitol Table. And, to our audience, it's a lot going on, and it will continue to move. And I think maybe to emphasize one thing Marina alluded to, that, this is here to stay now. And regardless of what happens with the final determination of tariffs, percentages, countries, movement of goods, et cetera, it's going to create movement and issues to address. But, with that, I think you also said opportunities to structure it
always
optimally, inappropriately. So thanks for joining us. And to our audience, thanks for joining us too. We'll see you next time on the Capitol Table.
You've been listening to the Capital Table. For more information, please visit withum.com. Thank you for listening.